We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Vav Amud Beis in Mesechet Yevamos. This is Yevamos Daf 76b. The Gemara is talking about the marriage between Shlomo HaMelech and Bas Paro. And so the Gemara says when it came to that situation, she actually did convert to Judaism. And even though they weren't having converts in general at the time of David and Shlomo, that was only because the people were converting for ulterior motives, because they wanted to partake of the Shulchan Malachim, meaning to say they wanted to join the Jewish people who were ascendant at that time. But the daughter of Paro was a princess, halot tzricha. She didn't need that, so her conversion was considered justified, and therefore, again, that's why it says Vayischatein Shlomo. Shlomo had chasnas with her because she had converted. She was no longer in Ovedas Kochavim. But the Gemara says, one second, but even if she did convert, how could Shlomo HaMelech marry her? She was a first-generation Mitzri convert, and that is forbidden. The halacha is that only the third generation of Mitzri converts are allowed to marry into the community. And the Gemara continues, if you're going to say the original Mitzrayim, they've already went away, they don't exist anymore. And these Mitzrayim over here are different people, and the halacha does not apply to them, as Rashi over here says. Hanoch azli li'alma mesu v'tovu b'mei Paro. They died, they drowned in the times of Paro. V'chiyazer achmona me'erev Rav, and maybe the Torah was warning against the Erev Rav. V'hani achrini ninu umos acherim bo v'yashva v'yartzam. Some of the people who live in Mitzrayim now are completely different people, and there is no Isser. But that's not true. The Gemara says, Vatanya, but we learned in a Brisa. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, Minyamin ger Mitzri hayali chaver mitalmidei Rabbi Akiva. Minyamin was a ger Mitzri. He was a Mitzri who converted. He was a friend of mine from the students of Rabbi Akiva. Amar, and he said, Ani Mitzri Rishon. I'm a first-generation Mitzri. V'nasasi Mitzris Rishon, and I married a first-generation Mitzris convert. Asi livni Mitzris Shniya. I'm going to have my son marry a second-generation Mitzris convert. Kedei sheyehei ben b'ni roi lava b'kal. That way my grandson will be able to marry into the community. In other words, the point is that we see that these individuals were considered Mitzrayim, and the halachas did apply to them. So again, we're back to the question, how did Shlomo HaMelech marry the daughter of Paro even if she did convert? And so the Gemara says, Amar Papa says, Anon mishlomo leiku v'nesev. Are we really coming and bringing a proof from Shlomo HaMelech? Shlomo lo nasev midi. Shlomo didn't marry at all. Rashi over here says, lo nasev midi ela liznus hayam iskavin. His relationship with the Bas Paro was just a relationship of znus. It was not a relationship of marriage. And the Gemara says, Dichsiv be, because it says over there, Min hagoyim asher amar Hashem el b'nei Yisrael, lo savo bohem v'hem, lo yavo b'chem. Achein yatuas levavchem acharei Eloheihem bohem davak Shlomo liyava. It says that Shlomo HaMelech cling to those people, those women that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said you shouldn't go with them, you shouldn't be with them, because they're going to turn you away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they're going to turn you towards Avodah Zarah. And the point over here is, it's davak Shlomo liyava. As Rashi over here says, davak Shlomo liyava v'lo leishas. It wasn't marriage over here. He just clung to them in a fashion of znus, and so therefore that has nothing to do with this. There is no chasnus by Ovedas Kochavim. And so the Gemara says, Elakasha vayischatin, but then we're back to our question, because the language of the pasuk over there says vayischatin. It does use a language of chasnus by Shlomo HaMelech. And so the Gemara says, Mitoch Ava Yisera Sha'ava, because of the great love that he had for her, Mala Olav HaKosav Ki'ilu Nischatin, but the pasuk considers it as if there was chasnus, but there is no chasnus by Ovdei Kochavim. And the Gemara continues, Amar Le Ravina Le Ravashi. Ravina said to Ravashi, V'hanon tanan, but didn't we learn in our Mishnah, Petzuadaka, Uchrushavcha Mutarim B'gioris U'Meshachreres? We said in our Mishnah that a Petzuadaka and a Krushavcha is mutter to be with a Gioris, to marry a Gioris and a Meshachreres. Habenesino Asiri, but by a Nesina, implication is that he's not allowed to marry a Nesina. And we just said in the Bryce above on the previous Amma that he is allowed to marry a Nesina. And so the Gemara continues, Amar Le, he said back to him, but according to your reasoning, Sefer, look at the end of our Mishnah. It says, Ve'enon asur and ela milava bakal. They're only prohibited from entering into the community. Habenesina sharu, that implies that they are allowed to marry a Nesina, because the Nesina is not part of the community. And so therefore the Gemara says, Ela mehalek ela mashma mina. Really, we can't learn anything from the Mishnah one way or another. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Ammoni u'Moavi asurim. When it comes to an Ammoni and a Moavi, meaning to say the male from Ammon and the male male from Moab, they're usher to marry into the community. V'isuran isur olam. That isur is forever. It doesn't matter how many generations. Avol nikvoseihem mutaros miyad. But if the female, meaning Amonis, Moavis, those are mutter immediately. They have no problem to convert and marry into the community. Mitzri ve'adomi einam asurim ela ad shlosha doros. When it comes to Mitzri and Adomi, so the prohibition is only until until 3 generations. Echad zecharim ve'echad nekevos. Doesn't matter if it's male or female. The halacha is the same. Rabbi Shimon maters on nekevos miyad. Rabbi Shimon says no. The nekevos by Mitzri and Adomi, they're mutter right away. They don't have to wait 3 generations. Amar Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says kal v'chomer advarim. It's actually kal v'chomer this way. Umayim b'mokom she'aser es hazecharim isur olam. If in a situation where the males are prohibited forever, meaning by Ammoni and Moavi, hitter es hanekevos miyad, so the females are permitted immediately, like we said, the Ammonis and the Moavis are permitted. So makam shelo aser es hazacharim ela ad shlosha doros. So in a situation where the prohibition is only 3 generations by the males, meaning to say by the Mitzri and the Adomi, so eino din shenatris hanekevos miyad. Shouldn't it be true that we allow the nekevos over there as well immediately? And so the Mishnah continues, Amru lo, so they said back to him, to Rabbi Shimon, Im halacha nekabel. If what you're saying is a tradition, as the halacha that you learn by tradition, we'll accept the tradition. V'im ladin, but if you're arguing this based on logic, yesh teshuva, we would have a response to such an argument. Amar lehem, he said to them, lo, no, ki halacha ani omer. I'm saying over here halacha that I learned by tradition. And the Gemara says, Minohani mili, from where do we know these words? In other words, from where do we know that an Ammonis and a Moavis, if they're females, they're permitted to enter the community? Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, the Amar Kra, because the Pasuk says, V'chiros Shol is David Yotzi l'Kras HaPlishti. It says, when Shol saw David HaMelech, Amar Avner Saratzava, ben Mizeh Hanar, Avner, he said, who is this the son of? Who is this person? V'yomar Avner, Chaynav Shucha HaMelech im Yadati. And Avner said, he didn't know. And so the Gemara now says, "V'lo yadalei," but is it true over here that Shaul did not know who David HaMelech was at this point? V'aksiv, but the pasuk says, "Vayohavei Mod," he loved him a lot. Vayhilo no se kelim, and he carried his kelim, so he clearly knew who David HaMelech was. Elo ahavua kamashal. So obviously Shaul was asking about David. He was asking who David's father was. But still the Gemara says, V'yaviv lo yadalei, did Shaul really not know Yishai, the father of David? V'aksiv, but the pasuk says, V'yish b'mei Shaul zaken bo v'anoshim. It says that the man was elderly in the days of Shaul, and he came with people. V'yamar Rav v'tema Rabbi Abba, and Rav says, and some people say Rabbi Abba says, Ze Yishai avi David. This refers to Yishai, the father of David. Shenichnas b'uchlasa v'yatza b'uchlasa. He would come in with multitudes of people and go out with multitudes of people. In other words, he was a well-known person. Shaul HaMelech should have known, just like he knew who David was, he should have known who Yishai was. And so the Gemara continues, Hachi Kamar Shaul. Here's what Shaul was saying. Imi Peretz asi, imi Zerach asi. He wanted to know, this David, does he come from Peretz or does he come from Zerach? Imi Peretz asi, if he comes from Peretz, so Malkahavi, he's going to be a king. Shamelech poretz lasos derech vein memachen biyada, because a king can make a breach in order to make a road for himself, and nobody can protest, nobody can stand in his way. And imi zerach asi, and that's the idea of Peretz, like the idea of poretz lasos derech. That's if he comes from Peretz. Imi zerach asi, but if he comes from Zerach, hashiva biyal mahavi, he'll be an important person, but he's not going to be the king. And so the Gemara continues, My taima amar le Shaul aleh. But what's the reason in the first place why Shaul asked Avner to inquire about David to see if he was fit for being the king? And the Gemara explains the chsiv, because the pasuk says Vayal be Shaul is David Madov. It says that Shaul gave David his garments kimidaso, and it means to say that it fit David HaMelech perfectly. Uchsiv be Shaul, and what does it say by Shaul? Meshichma v'ma'ala gavo mikol ha'am. It says from his shoulder and up he was taller than everybody. So how could it be that it fit David? So it must be that it was a nace. And therefore when Shaul saw this nace, he said we have to inquire about David to see if he's fit to become the king. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Doeg Hadomi, so Doeg Hadomi said to him, Ad shetam mashal olav im hagen hu lamalchasim lav, before you even inquire whether David is fit to be king or not, shal olav im roi lava bekalim lav, you should ask whether it's fit for David to marry into the community or not. My time, and what's the reason? Takasi me Rus HaMoaviyah, because he comes from Rus HaMoaviyah, and as we know, there's a prohibition for people from Moav to marry into the community. So Amar le Avner, so Avner responded to him, Tanina, no, we learned Ammoni v'lo Ammonis. The prohibition applies to Ammoni and not Ammonis. It only applies to the males. Moavi v'lo Moavis. It applies to the Moavi and not the Moavis. The same thing. It only applies to the males from Moav and not the females. So therefore, this does not pose a problem for David HaMelech. And the Gemara continues, Ela me'ata, but according to that, mamzer v'lo mamzeres, make the same drasha by mamzer. It only applies to the males and not to the mamzeres, not to the females. And to that the Gemara says, mamzer ksiv mumzar. He's called a mamzer, and what that means is there's like a strange blemish, meaning it's again something that the child was born from an illicit relationship, and that applies to males and females alike. And the Gemara continues along the same lines. Mitzri v'lo mitzris. Maybe we should say a mitzri and not a mitzris. It shouldn't apply to females. The prohibition again for the Egyptians to marry into the community. And the Gemara finally answers, Shani hacha, no, it's different over here. The mefarish time in the kruk, because when we talk about the Ammoni, the pasuk actually explains the reason why they are not allowed to marry into the community. It says, Al ashelo kidmu eschem belechem uvemayim. It says because they didn't come out to greet you with bread and water when you were leaving Mitzrayim. That's why there's this prohibition against the Ammoni. And what does it mean? Darko shalish lekadem. It's really only the way of man, the way of men to come out and greet in this fashion. Velo darko shalisha lekadem. It's not the way of women to do that. And therefore, the entire prohibition by Ammon and Moab applies only to the males and not the females. But the Gemara continues still. Hayolem lekadem anoshim likras anoshim, v'noshim likras noshim. So Doeg makes the argument that the men should have greeted the men and the women should have greeted the women. So the Gemara says, Ishtik, he was silent. He didn't have an answer for this. Miyad, so immediately, Vayomer HaMelech, the king said, Shol ato ben mizeh ha'elim. Go find out who is this young man. Who is he the son of? Who is he a descendant of? And the Gemara says, Hasam karile nar, hacha karile elam. Over there, he refers to David as a nar, as a lad, and here he's calling him elam. Why the change in language? And the Gemara explains, Hachi kamarle. Here's what he was saying to him. Halacha nisalma mimcha. He says it's clear that the halacha is hidden from you. You're not sure about this issue. Tzei v'shol beveis hamedrash. Go and ask in the beis hamedrash what is the status over here in terms of David HaMelech, who's a descendant from Rus. So Shaul, he asked the question. Amrulei, they said to him, Ammoni v'lo Ammonis. It applies to the male Ammoni, not to the female, not to the Ammonis. Moavi v'lo Moavis. It applies to the Moavi, the male, and not the Moavis, not the female. And we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Zayin Amar Aleph.